It began with a dream of precision, a vision born in the quiet hum of German factories, where engineers in gray coats bent over blueprints like priests over scripture. In 1937, as the world drifted toward another war, Adolf Hitler's generals demanded a machine that could see farther, move faster, and strike deeper than any before. They called it a leichter Panzersparwagen, a light-armored reconnaissance car. To the engineers of the Third Reich, it was more than a vehicle. It was a statement. Germany would never again crawl. It would race. The design that emerged from Otto Union and Horch was unlike anything on the road. The Sd.Kfz 222 was compact but sharp-edged, its body all angles and purpose, like a steel insect ready to pounce. Its frame was made from welded armor plates that gleamed under the factory lights. Beneath the hood growled a 3.5-liter Horch V8 engine capable of propelling the vehicle at over 80 kilometers per hour on roads, a staggering speed for its class. It had four-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, and a suspension system designed for agility. On paper, it was everything German engineering aspired to be: efficient, elegant, and ahead of its time. Mounted atop this sleek chassis was its soul, an open-topped turret housing a 20-centimeter KWK-30 autocannon, paired with a 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun. Together, they gave the 222 a bite far greater than its size suggested. German officers who witnessed the first live-fire demonstrations in 1938 described it with awe. "It moves like a panther and strikes like a wasp," one wrote in his report. The weapon could destroy soft-skinned vehicles, strafe infantry, and even fend off low-flying aircraft. The vehicle's appearance became an icon of Nazi propaganda. In newsreels shown in Berlin cinemas, the Sd.Kfz 222 raced through mock battlefields, its turret swinging confidently as shells erupted in the background. It embodied everything the Reich wanted the world to believe about German industry: clean lines, perfect function, unstoppable motion. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland in September 1939, the 222 led the way. Reconnaissance units fanned out ahead of the Panzer columns, their armored cars skimming across muddy fields and cobblestone roads, radio antennae flickering like insect feelers. For the soldiers inside, the vehicle felt alive, responsive, powerful, and precise. Drivers loved the smooth steering, the way the V8 hummed beneath their feet. Gunners admired the stability of the turret and the crisp rhythm of the autocannon. It was the perfect marriage of speed and firepower, man and machine. One lieutenant in the 2nd Panzer Division described his 222 as a thoroughbred, elegant, proud, and loyal. He meant it. In those early months of Blitzkrieg, the Sd.Kfz 222 was the spearpoint of modern war. When Germany turned west in 1940, the little armored car became the eyes of the advancing army. From the fields of Belgium to the roads of France, the 222 darted ahead of the tanks, finding enemy columns, calling in artillery, and sowing chaos. Its radios, the Fug 5 and Fug Spur GE, gave it communication range and coordination unmatched by Allied scouts. French troops, hearing its high-pitched engine echoing through the countryside, began to fear the sound. "It comes before the storm," one French captain said. In those months, the legend of German engineering seemed unbreakable. The Sd.Kfz 222 represented everything that made Blitzkrieg work: precision movement, communication, and mobility. American military observers watching the campaign from afar were stunned. Reports sent back to Washington described the German armored cars as masterpieces of design, light, efficient, tactically flawless. Photographs in Life magazine showed sleek columns of 222s racing down captured French roads, their crews confident and clean-cut, the black crosses on their hulls gleaming in the sun. Inside Germany, production ramped up. The Horch and Eisenach plants ran day and night, producing hundreds of units under the direction of the Waffenamt, the German Army Ordnance Office. Engineers tweaked small details: stronger turret mesh to deflect grenades, better radiators for heat management, improved gun mounts for accuracy. To the world, it seemed that nothing could surpass German craftsmanship. But beneath the surface, the flaws were already there, invisible cracks in the myth. The armor, though precisely angled, was only 8 millimeters thick at most, enough to deflect rifle fire, but useless against heavy machine guns. The open turret that made the vehicle light and fast also left the crew exposed to grenades, snipers, and even debris. The suspension, designed for Europe's paved roads, groaned under the strain of rough terrain, and the intricate mechanical systems, built with hand-fitted parts, required constant maintenance. Each bolt, each bearing, each gear was the work of craftsmen, not mass production. For an army moving at lightning speed across France, these weaknesses didn't matter, yet. The roads were smooth, the weather mild, the campaign short. But soon the war would leave the highways of Europe and enter landscapes that cared nothing for craftsmanship. Deserts, steppes, and swamps. There, perfection would become fragility. Still, in 1941, as the Africa Corps prepared to sail for Libya, the Sd.Kfz 222 was at the height of its fame. Rommel himself admired it, calling it the eyes of the desert. In the propaganda films produced before the campaign, the 222 was shown leaping dunes, its gun blazing, the perfect companion to the mighty Panzer divisions. Young German mechanics painted names on their vehicles, Adler, Blitz, Fuchs, and spoke of them with affection. In the sand-swept ports of Naples and Tripoli, the armored cars gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, their gray paint reflecting light like mirrors. They looked unstoppable, like jewels of war. American intelligence analysts who saw captured photos in 1941 called them technical marvels. The U.S. Army, still using open-top scout cars and motorcycles for reconnaissance, could only admire from afar. But the desert would tell a different story. It would strip away the polish, the paint, and the myth, until all that remained was steel, dust, and truth.
When the first ships of the Africa Corps landed in Tripoli in February 1941, the air was alive with the smell of salt, fuel, and ambition. German soldiers, bronzed by the Mediterranean sun, rolled their vehicles down the ramps and onto the wharves of North Africa. Among the tanks and trucks, the Sd.Kfz 222s gleamed like silver arrows, angular, elegant, and confident. They were the eyes of the desert fox, the machines that would scout the endless sands ahead of Rommel's armored spearheads. To the men who drove them, the African sun was blinding, but the promise of conquest burned brighter. As the convoy snaked east toward El Agheila, the 222s led the way, light, fast, and fearless. Their V8 engines purred smoothly in the cool dawn air. Dust plumed behind them as they raced across the dunes, their 20mm cannons swiveling like watchful eyes. For the first weeks, everything worked as planned. The vehicles were poetry in motion, and their crews believed they were driving perfection itself. But the desert, indifferent and eternal, had other plans. By midday, the heat began its slow, merciless work. Metal expanded, oil thinned, and the fine-tuned machinery, built for the autobahns of Europe, began to falter. The narrow radiator struggled to cool the engines. The thin filters clogged with sand, gearboxes seized. When the sun set, temperatures plunged, and the same machines that had overheated hours before now froze under the desert cold. The German engineers had designed a marvel. The Sahara turned it into a liability. Inside the 222, life was misery. The open turret that once seemed so practical in the temperate fields of France now became a curse. There was no shade. The steel hull turned into an oven. The crew, usually 3 men, baked in the heat, their hands blistering on the metal controls. The gunner, perched under the folding wire mesh turret cover, squinted through waves of distortion rising from the barrel. The driver could see almost nothing through the slits in his armored windshield, and when he did, it was only sand, sand, and more sand. The desert punished precision. The finely machined bolts and joints that made German vehicles smooth on European roads became traps for dust. The 222 suspension, built with tight tolerances, had no patience for grit. Sand infiltrated everything: bearings, transmissions, turret rings. The mechanics at field workshops called it the creeping death. Vehicles would return from patrols with their wheels locked solid, axles groaning like wounded animals. The beautifully crafted armor plates began to show corrosion, their once perfect welds cracking under vibration. Even the gun, the proud 2-centimeter Kwk-30 autocannon, betrayed them. It jammed constantly. The recoil springs overheated, the barrels warped in the desert heat, and the delicate optics fogged with condensation at night. In some units, crews learned to fire short, conservative bursts to avoid damaging their own weapons. "We had to baby it like a sick child," one gunner of the 33rd Reconnaissance Battalion later said. "Every hour we were cleaning, scraping, fixing. Every grain of sand was an enemy." Rommel's advance across Cyrenaica was lightning fast, and the 222s were his scouts, his pathfinders. They pushed far ahead of the main columns, sometimes operating alone for days. They spotted British patrols, ambushed convoys, and harassed retreating units. But the farther they went, the more fragile they became. The desert turned speed into danger and beauty into burden. In March 1941, a German reconnaissance detachment near Mersa Brega found itself stranded. All 5 of its Sd.Kfz 222s had broken down, 2 with snapped drive shafts, 3 with collapsed suspensions. Their engines were filled with sand, their transmissions refused to shift. When British armored cars appeared on the horizon, the Germans had no choice but to fight with what still worked, their 20mm guns and their pride. They held off the attack, but only barely. Afterward, the survivors trudged back on foot, leaving their beloved machines to the wind. One of those abandoned vehicles would later be recovered by the British, the first intact Sd.Kfz 222 captured in the desert. The inspecting officer's report was a mixture of admiration and disbelief. A vehicle of exquisite design, but entirely unsuited for prolonged field operations. Its engineering is that of a jeweler, not a soldier. Still, the Germans fought on. Rommel's genius lay in motion, and the 222s were vital to that rhythm. They scouted for supply routes, flanked British columns, and acted as forward observers for artillery. In the first months of 1942, they played their part in the victories at Gazala and Tobruk. When the Afrika Korps surged east toward El Alamein, the 222 was there, dusty, battle-scarred, but still running. But then, the myth was fading even among its crews. The soldiers who had once boasted of German perfection now carried toolboxes as often as rifles. They learned to improvise repairs with wire, canvas, and scrap metal. They used captured British fuel filters, added canvas skirts to block sand, and poured water over radiators just to keep engines alive. The elegant beast had become a patient on life support. Every morning, one mechanic from the 15th Panzer Division recalled, we prayed that they would start, and when they did, it was a miracle. By the winter of 1942, as the tide of war began to turn, the 222s were dying faster than they could be replaced. Supply convoys from Europe were being sunk in the Mediterranean. Spare parts were scarce. For every 3 armored cars lost in combat, 2 more simply fell apart. Their transmissions cracked, their suspensions collapsed, and their tires shredded on the rocks. The desert, patient, relentless, was stripping German engineering bare. Rommel himself, in a rare moment of frustration, complained to Berlin, "The 222 is a fine machine for parades, not for the desert. We need vehicles that live longer than their paint." It was a harsh truth for an army that had built its reputation on precision. The 222 had been the pride of German reconnaissance, swift, intelligent, and refined. Now it was rusting in the sands, its engines silent, its turrets half buried. And when the Americans finally arrived in North Africa in late 1942, they found the wreckage of that legend scattered across the dunes. To them, it was both a warning and an invitation. These were the machines they had been told to fear, the icons of German engineering perfection. Soon, they would take them apart and discover how fragile that perfection truly was.
In the spring of 1943, as the last battles of the North African campaign raged across the hills of Tunisia, the myth of German invincibility was dying in the dust. The once proud columns of the Afrika Korps were in retreat, their panzers shattered, their fuel tanks dry. The deserts that had once echoed with the growl of engines now lay silent, scattered with burned-out wrecks, tanks, trucks, and the twisted skeletons of the elegant Sd.Kfz 222. When the fighting finally ended, the Americans moved in to survey what remained. The U.S. Army Ordnance Teams, mechanics in olive drab instead of scientists in lab coats, fanned out across the captured fields with clipboards and wrenches. Their orders were clear: recover anything German that still had bolts on it. Every weapon, every truck, every armored car was to be studied. In May 1943, one of those teams from the 1st Armored Division stumbled upon a prize. Near a ridge east of Beja, they found an Sd.Kfz 222 that had been abandoned almost intact. Its tires were flat, its paint sandblasted to dull gray, but its engine was still there. The gun, a 20mm KWK-30, sat locked in place, pointing toward the horizon as if waiting for an order that never came. The Americans circled it in silence. They had heard about these machines. German engineering wonders, the reports called them. Now they would see what that meant. They towed the vehicle to a forward depot, then onto a transport ship bound for the proving grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland. There, under a soft spring rain far removed from the African sun, American engineers finally met the legend. They approached it with the reverence of men examining a captured dragon. "Everything the Germans build," one officer remarked, "is supposed to be perfect. Let's find out." At first glance, it was exactly what they expected. The armor plates were cut and welded with care. The internal fittings were tidy and deliberate, each cable neatly routed, each lever machined to tolerances that spoke of precision craftsmanship. Even the instrument dials were beautiful, clean German fonts, white on black, marked Horkwerk AG. It looked like something built by artists who worshipped machines. But when the wrenches turned and the panels came off, the illusion cracked. Inside, the mechanics found corrosion everywhere. The bolts on the suspension mounts were rusted deep into their threads. The wiring harness was brittle and frayed. The steering linkage, that masterpiece of dual-axle precision, was coated in desert dust that had fused into a cement-like paste. The bearings had seized. The once smooth gearbox was scored and pitted. "It's like they built a Swiss watch and drove it into a sandstorm," one engineer muttered. They expected hardened steel in the armor. What they found was thin plate, barely 8 mm thick. A single burst from a Browning .30 caliber machine gun had already punched through the side of the hull. Inside the turret, fragments of shrapnel had lodged in the gunner's seat. The open-top design, which had seemed ingenious for visibility, now looked suicidal. "One grenade in here," a U.S. captain noted, "and that's the end of the crew." The vehicle's cooling system told the same story. The radiator was undersized, the fan belt delicate, the filters laughably small. "You can't run this thing in Kansas, let alone the Sahara," another mechanic wrote in his report. The suspension, a marvel of four-wheel steering, was also its curse. The linkages were too fine, the geometry too sensitive. Any heavy shock could bend the rods out of alignment, and once they did, the vehicle steered like a drunk. "Maintenance every 20 miles, the Americans joked. German perfection. What fascinated them most was the contradiction, craftsmanship that defied mass production. Every nut and bolt seemed slightly different, every panel fitted by hand. It was beautiful and totally impractical for a world at war. The Americans, used to the brute simplicity of the Willys Jeep and the M8 Greyhound, were stunned. "If this thing breaks," one sergeant said, tapping the hull, "you need a piano tuner, not a mechanic." As the inspection continued, admiration gave way to understanding. The Sd.Kfz 222 was not the product of superior genius. It was the product of a culture that confused precision with perfection. It worked until the world got dirty. The engineers compared it to their own M8 armored car. The M8 was heavier, rougher, built for punishment rather than elegance. It lacked the Germans' polish, but it could be repaired in the field with a hammer and a wrench. The Sd.Kfz 222 required a workshop. The M8 required elbow grease. And in the war of movement, the latter mattered more. When the American ordnance officers compiled their final report, they did not mock the vehicle. They respected it, but they saw through it. The Sd.Kfz 222 is a finely made but overly complex machine. It is unsuited for prolonged field operations due to poor cooling, fragile suspension, and thin armor protection. It represents excellent design without adequate adaptation to environment or production scale. In simpler words, a beautiful mistake. For months afterwards, the captured German armored cars became study pieces across U.S. training schools. Officers pointed to the 222's delicate steering, its narrow tires, its thin hull. This, they told their students, is why you build for the battlefield, not the showroom. The myth of German mechanical infallibility began to unravel, not because of propaganda, but because of a wrench and a flashlight. Even the engineers who had once idolized German craftsmanship began to change their minds. "We all thought the Germans were 10 years ahead," one ordnance officer said later. "But when you get close, you see they built for form, not function. They made machines to impress generals, not survive privates." Back in North Africa, American soldiers were making the same discovery firsthand. Many of the captured Sd.Kfz 222s were pressed into Allied service, at least briefly. The British and Free French tried to use them for patrols. They didn't last long. The engines failed, the parts broke, and soon the Allied mechanics parked them for good. One British corporal summed it up with dry humor. "Looks like a racing car, fights like a sewing machine." By the end of 1943, the myth had been replaced by a new kind of respect, the sober recognition that war doesn't reward elegance, it rewards endurance. The Sd.Kfz 222 had been designed in the confident years of Germany's rise, when the factories were full, the materials were pure, and the engineers had all the time in the world. But war is not kind to art. In the deserts of Africa and the workshops of Aberdeen, its beauty turned to burden. When one American mechanic finished reassembling the vehicle after its tests, he stood back, wiped his hands, and said quietly, "Hell of a thing to look at, but I wouldn't bet my life on it." And in that single sentence, the legend of German perfection died, not on the battlefield, but in the calm, methodical hands of the men who had taken it apart and found what lay beneath. By late 1943, the lessons from North Africa were written not in ink, but in oil and rust. Across American proving grounds and Allied workshops, the dismantled remains of German vehicles told the same story. Perfection had failed the test of war. And none made that lesson clearer than the captured Sd.Kfz 222, now a teaching tool for an army that valued endurance over elegance. In the U.S. ordnance reports that followed, engineers compared the German and American design philosophies line by line. Where Germany favored precision, America favored practicality. The Sd.Kfz 222's engine compartment, they noted, was a masterpiece of tight engineering, compact, efficient, and hopelessly impractical. To change a fuel pump, you had to remove an entire side panel. To access the differential, you needed to disassemble the rear axle. Every component was hand-fitted, impossible to replace without exact parts. "It's the work of a craftsman," one report said, "not an army." The American M8 Greyhound, by contrast, looked crude beside it. Its welds were rough, its fittings loose, its armor uneven. But you could fix it in a ditch. You could replace its wheels with parts from a truck. You could pull the engine out with a field crane in under 2 hours. It was ugly, but it lived. The Sd.Kfz 222 was beautiful, but it died young. As U.S. armored divisions prepared for the next phase of the war, Italy and then France, the engineers' findings began to shape doctrine. In training fields across the American South, officers told their crews what the Germans had taught them without meaning to. Simplicity wins wars. Vehicles were to be easy to maintain, easy to build, and easy to replace. The battlefield was no place for perfection. At Fort Knox, sergeants used the captured 222 as a cautionary exhibit. "This," one sergeant said, slapping the side of its hull, "is what happens when you build something to impress engineers instead of soldiers." The trainees would nod, peering inside the cramped interior, the narrow seats, the delicate controls, the exposed gunner's perch. "Looks fancy, but I wouldn't want to be in there when it gets hit," another said. Meanwhile, in Europe, American troops were seeing firsthand how quickly German machinery could crumble under strain. The once feared panzer divisions were bogged down not just by Allied firepower, but by their own vehicles. The tanks and armored cars that had rolled across France in 1940 now broke down in convoys before ever reaching the front. Spare parts were scarce, maintenance crews exhausted, and even the legendary Tiger tanks, marvels of design, often failed simply because their transmissions couldn't handle the weight. The myth of German efficiency was unraveling in every theater. Their machines looked like masterpieces, one U.S. mechanic wrote home from Italy, until you realize you'd need a factory to fix them. At the same time, American production was hitting a stride the world had never seen. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago were turning out thousands of trucks, jeeps, and armored cars every week. The parts were interchangeable, the designs standardized. Every bolt fit every vehicle. To an American engineer, it wasn't just mass production, it was philosophy made real. The captured Sd.Kfz 222, stripped and analyzed, became a symbol of contrast. Germany built for excellence, America built for endurance. The difference was industrial and spiritual at once. The Germans saw machines as expressions of national pride, precise, flawless, elegant. The Americans saw them as tools, rough, functional, and replaceable. An ordnance officer summarized it perfectly in his final 1944 assessment. The Germans build weapons to last forever. We build weapons to win the war. It was more than a quip. It was the truth that defined the conflict. In Tunisia and Sicily, American soldiers had already begun to lose their fear of German vehicles. Where they once had admired the sleek armored cars of the Afrika Korps, now they saw them as brittle, fast but fragile, dangerous only until they broke. Many had learned to spot the 222 silhouette on the horizon, small, triangular, darting across the sand. They no longer panicked. A burst from a Browning 50 caliber would punch through its thin armor and set it ablaze. We learned, one gunner said, that the fancy stuff burns the same as the rest. Even Rommel's men began to feel the weight of that truth. The Afrika Korps mechanics, who once boasted of their machines' precision, now cursed their complexity. They scavenged parts from wrecks, jury-rigged repairs with British components, and prayed that their next batch of fuel would last long enough to get home. The desert had humbled them. Back in Germany, the factories could no longer produce replacements with the same care they used to before. Allied bombing campaigns had crippled production, forcing the Germans to cut corners. The later batches of Sd.Kfz 222s were a shadow of the originals: rougher welds, cheaper steel, rushed assembly. The vehicle that had once embodied the spirit of precision was now the victim of industrial desperation. The very perfection that had defined German engineering now strangled it. As the war turned against the Axis, American analysts began to see the bigger picture. The Sd.Kfz 222 wasn't just a flawed machine, it was a symbol of an empire's failure to adapt. The same obsession that had driven Germany's engineers to greatness had blinded them to reality. You couldn't handcraft victory. An internal U.S. Army report in 1945 described the German approach bluntly. They build racehorses, we build mules, and mules carry the day. The report went on to recommend that all future American designs follow the principles of modularity, interchangeability, and field repair. The Sd.Kfz 222 had taught them by negative example what not to do. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, American mechanics walked through captured motor pools filled with wrecked vehicles, Tigers, half-tracks, armored cars. They admired their craftsmanship but shook their heads. "They're all too damn complicated," one sergeant said. "It's like they forgot they were building for war." Among those relics, in one depot outside Koblenz, sat a line of Sd.Kfz 222s, rusted, dusty, their once proud insignias fading. The men who found them knew their story by heart now. The myth had come full circle. What had begun as a triumph of engineering had ended as a monument to overconfidence. The Americans, armed with grease-stained hands and practical minds, had taken the legend apart, bolt by bolt, and found the truth inside. By the time the war ended, one quiet consensus had spread among the Allied engineers. The Germans built a war of art, and America built a war of industry. The Sd.Kfz 222, once the elegant beast of the Blitzkrieg, was now an artifact of that philosophy, a warning written in steel. Precision had its price. When the war ended in 1945, the battlefields of Europe and North Africa became silent museums of ruin. The machines that had once roared across continents now stood still, engines seized, paint faded, their iron hearts cold. In the midst of the wreckage, the Sd.Kfz 222 was an almost poetic sight, small, graceful, and utterly defeated. For a time, it still carried the aura of the legend it had been, the sleek, angular face of German engineering. But when the smoke cleared and the world began to study what was left, the myth of perfection that surrounded it finally collapsed under the weight of truth. The Americans, meticulous as always, kept their captured 222s stored at Aberdeen and Fort Knox for post-war analysis. The British did the same at Buddington. Each vehicle became a time capsule, preserved evidence of how a great industrial nation could lose itself in its own craftsmanship. Technicians who examined them in the following years were astonished, not by their brilliance, but by their fragility. The same flaws that had plagued them in Tunisia were still there. The weak welds, the brittle suspension arms, the paper-thin armor. The desert hadn't lied. In 1946, an Aberdeen ordnance officer wrote one of the last official reports on the Sd.Kfz 222. His tone was almost sympathetic. The German Sd.Kfz 222 demonstrates great care in design and execution, but reveals the fatal weakness of all over-refined machines, the inability to endure neglect. That single line was the eulogy for a philosophy. As the Cold War dawned, the Sd.Kfz 222s were quietly scrapped, melted down for steel, or sold to local militaries still rebuilding after the chaos. A few found second lives. The French army used captured examples in North Africa for colonial patrols. The Spanish converted some into police vehicles. Even China, far away from the deserts where the myth had died, received a handful through captured Axis stockpiles. But everywhere they went, the story ended the same way. The machines broke down faster than anyone could maintain them. By the early 1950s, they were gone from service, elegant ghosts of a dead empire. Meanwhile, their opposite numbers, the American M8 Greyhound and the humble Willys Jeep, rolled on through Korea and beyond. What the Germans had built to inspire awe, the Americans had built to outlast time. The 222 was beautiful, one U.S. officer later said, but beauty doesn't win wars. Spare parts do. The irony was sharp. The vehicle that once symbolized technological superiority became the prime example of what not to do. In lectures and military design schools throughout the 1950s, Allied instructors used it as a case study in the failure of over-engineering. The lesson was universal. Complexity without durability is vanity. Yet for all its flaws, the Sd.Kfz 222 refused to vanish from memory. Historians and enthusiasts couldn't forget it. It had been, after all, one of the most recognizable machines of the Blitzkrieg. Its wedge-shaped hull, twin-barreled turret, and spiderweb gun shield appeared in every wartime newsreel and propaganda film. When model kits and documentaries began to appear in the post-war decades, the 222 was always there, small, fast, and iconic. Collectors in the 1970s and 80s began to search for the few that remained. They found them buried in sand near Tobruk, half-rusted in barns in Bavaria, and decaying in scrapyards across Europe. Restorers spoke of them with reverence and frustration. "It's like resurrecting a violin from a hurricane," one British mechanic joked. The parts were impossible to find, and even when restored, the vehicles required constant care, just as they had in Africa. Each restored Sd.Kfz 222 that appeared at a museum or reenactment became a paradox, a symbol of engineering excellence and failure intertwined. People admired its shape, its craftsmanship, its aura of efficiency. Few remembered that it had collapsed under its own perfection. Meanwhile, historians began to connect the story of the 222 to a larger truth about the war. Germany had been defeated not only by numbers,
but by philosophy. Its industry had created masterpieces, tanks, aircraft, armored cars, each one a marvel of precision. But they were fragile, slow to build, and impossible to maintain at scale. The United States, in contrast, had turned its factories into engines of mass production. What Germany achieved through art, America achieved through volume. The Sd.Kfz 222 was the microcosm of that contrast. Every weld carefully placed, every surface beautifully machined, and yet, in the end, useless against dust, distance, and time. One post-war German engineer interviewed by Allied historians in 1948 admitted as much. "We built like clockmakers, the Americans built like blacksmiths, and the blacksmiths won." It was an epitaph not just for the 222, but for the entire myth of German mechanical invincibility. Today, fewer than a dozen Sd.Kfz 222s survive in working condition. One sits in the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, another at Samar in France, and a handful in private collections. Their paint has been lovingly restored, their engines coaxed back to life. When they move, the sound is delicate, a hum, not a roar, like a ghost clearing its throat. Visitors stand around them with an awe, taking photographs, whispering words like precision, craftsmanship, and beauty. But if you look closer, the truth still shows. Beneath the polish, the welds are thin, the joints creak. The design, so beautiful in 1939, still carries the same flaw it did in 1943, a soul too delicate for war. Every now and then during restoration work, a mechanic finds an original German marking inside a panel, a signature, a serial number, sometimes a faint pencil note from the factory. The craftsmanship still inspires respect. It's easy to imagine the young engineer who built it, proud of his work, never dreaming that one day an American mechanic halfway across the world would take it apart and shake his head in disbelief. "Beautiful," the American would say, "but useless." That line, passed down through decades of memoirs and workshops, became the perfect summary of the machine and the myth behind it. The Sd.Kfz 222 had begun as a masterpiece of precision, the sleek face of a regime that promised perfection through engineering. But it ended as a warning etched in steel. Perfection means nothing if it can't survive the real world. In the end, it was not a shell or a bullet that destroyed the Sd.Kfz 222. It was the sand, the rust, and the relentless grind of reality, forces that care nothing for craftsmanship. The Americans who captured it in 1943 never forgot the lesson. The Germans who built it never wanted to remember it, but history remembered for them. The myth of German perfection didn't die in battle. It died under the wrench of a mechanic. One twist, one rusted bolt, one realization at a time. And when the last 222 rolled into a museum, polished and still, it no longer represented power or pride. It represented the truth. That in war, as in life, beauty means nothing if it breaks too easily.